All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me if I speak at this level? This is all right? How's everyone doing today? I feel like in the past there's been a more enthusiastic response. But it's cold today, so that's part of it. Before we start, Anne asked me to remind everyone to silence their phones. I just did that myself. I have had my own phone ring in my pockets when I've been speaking, and it's very strange because you sort of glare out at the audience wondering who dared to not silence their phone, and then of course it was me. The thing I was most nervous about this week, and you probably didn't notice this, but last week I was wearing silver shoes. And so when people were filing in, people said, I can't wait to see what shoes you wear next week. And so I spent the whole week terrified, thinking, how can I up my shoe game? So we're not speaking about anything related to the color green this week, but I figured that this was at least somewhat more playful. So thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be back for the second of 5 lectures in the Luis Martín lecture series in the Humanities this spring. As you know, I decided to speak about objects in the permanent collection. So last week we spoke about this silver processional cross that I'm happy to say will be in the exhibition of Spanish Renaissance sculpture that opens at the end of March. So you'll have an opportunity to see it there and hopefully think back on some of the things we spoke about. This week we'll be speaking about one of my favorite paintings in the collection, this portrait of a knight of Santiago, of the Order of Santiago, and we'll be talking about all of the different ways in which we can think about this painting together. And then, as discussed next week, we'll talk about this spectacular mid-17th century drawing, followed by a sculpture by one of the few women artists in the collection, Luisa Roldan, or La Roldana, depicting the infant St. John the Baptist. And we'll conclude with a 19th century picture, but one that will allow us to look back and think back on how Spanish history was thought of and constructed in the 19th century. Now, today, I've divided the lecture into 3 parts. The first, we'll walk through the picture together, walk through the painting together, thinking about its different elements, or the elements that I at least found more or less interesting. Then we'll talk about Spanish Naples, although there have been some questions in the past about the attribution of this painting, that is to say, who actually painted it. Since it's not signed, I think it's pretty clear that it comes out of the Spanish Neapolitan context, and we'll talk about what Spanish Naples was and what its characteristics were. And finally, we will talk about who the knight is who is depicted in this picture, because that also is not certain. And I'll end with a bit of a provocation that comes out of my most recent research. So you'll be privy to some of my more crazy ideas. To begin with discussing the painting, I'm sure that many of you have seen this work in our galleries. It's a large painting in oil on canvas depicting a figure. The format is what's known as 3/4 length, so we see him more or less from the knees up. He's depicted life-size, so he very much reads as a real individual, and he's painted in quite a naturalistic way, so in a way that makes us feel that we're in the presence of a real person. He is, of course, a military commander, and he's wearing the fashion of the day. Around his neck, he has something called a golilla collar, and this was a specific type of collar that, beginning in 1623, was actually required by law for any male who appeared at court in the presence of Philip IV, the king. This was part of the sartorial regime that was regulated in Spain and, by extension, in its colonial holdings in the period. And the golilla is interesting. There's only one surviving golilla, which is actually in Sweden, believe it or not. It was and it's very well documented. There's a fascinating article that I've listed at the bottom for you by a scholar named Amanda Wonder on innovation and tradition at the court of Philip IV. And this golilla was part of a suit that a young Spanish envoy to the, a young Swedish envoy to the Spanish court had made, writing back to his uncle in order to justify the considerable expense, saying, I cannot appear before the king without this new outfit. And it included this, this collar, the golilla collar, which was a piece of stiff lace-like fabric worn over a undercollar known as a valona to create this sort of effect. So I thought that it was worth showing us that our sitter is wearing precisely such a stiff, elevated, or raised collar that we see so often in Spanish portraits of men from the period. Below it, you can just make out by the glint on the metal here, he's wearing what's called a gorget. A gorget is the only piece of actual armor that we have in this portrait. So for a military commander, actually he's chosen not to be depicted in the full armor that we so often see in portraits of men from the period. If you think to, for instance, the 16th century portrait we have in the galleries by Antonis More, there's a good example of, oh, is he actually wearing armor? He's partial armor? Partial armor also, but certainly more than we have here. This is an example of a much more decorative gorget, but from a similar period, also from the 1630s, where you can see that this is the piece of armor that would have protected the man's neck, shoulder blades, and front of the chest. He is holding a piece of wood that is known as a baston de mando, something that identifies him as a capitán general, a captain general in the Spanish army. It's once more an insignia of a military commander. We see it, a similar object, being oftentimes carried by the King of Spain, and as a representative of the King of Spain, this individual would, of course, also been privy to carrying the same type of military object, the importance of which was not self-defense, it was symbolic. This was a symbolic object that marked him as having this important position in the military hierarchy of the day. Now, he is, of course, maybe my favorite detail of this painting, wearing glasses. Hard to miss. And we're actually very lucky in Dallas to have not one but two Spanish paintings from the period where people wear glasses, suggesting that actually glasses were more common in the day than might seem. Now, just a few years prior, the first European treatise on wearing glasses, on the making and wearing of glasses, was written in Spain on the use of the anteojos, as it's called, the before the eyes, as they're called. But this was an object that had already been in existence for about 3 centuries. So beginning in the 1300s, it's estimated, monks began polishing glass in order to create lenses that could eventually be adapted into objects that corrected sight. So this was their function, of course, although we see that they're here not yet the traditional glasses that will have the over-ear supporting mechanism that, of course, we use today. The symbolism of the glasses is also something that we should consider. Because, of course, on the one hand, glasses are connected to ideas of perspicacity, the ability to notice small details, studiousness, intelligence. This wonderful engraving of an owl with glasses, of course, boils down all of these ideas into one image. We see them frequently in depictions of individuals who, of course, on the one hand, probably actually wore glasses, but individuals also who achieved some sort of advanced status, probably through learning, probably through something that, like today, we would have thought, oh yes, someone with glasses is obviously very, very well read. This is in some ways the association that we still have today. What I love about this portrait is that in no way does the painter or the sitter shy away from the features that mark him as a person of advancing age. This wonderful little appearance of white in the beard and in the whiskers, the wrinkles that Ribera has almost physically carved out. If you look at it from an angle, you can see how almost sculptural that feature of the painting is. And of course, the glasses, suggesting that all of these things register someone who has a lot of experience, right? His experience has come with time, and he is proud to, in some ways, announce that he has achieved his status with time and with experience. Ribera has, this would be not the first time that the painter depicted glasses. Many of you may know this painting from the Franz Mayer Museum in Mexico City. If not, worth the 2-hour flight to Mexico City to go see it, which is one of the earliest known paintings by the young Ribera in Rome, part of a series allegorizing the different senses, taste, hearing, and of course sight. And we see here among these different objects that in some ways refer to sight, alongside a mirror, the first known depiction of a telescope in a painting, and of course this pair of very similar glasses lying on the ledge in front of this individual who, you'll notice the window here is really not the source of light. The light is coming from above him and to the left, but the window in some ways is only a place to which he can look with his telescope. So the window also becomes in some ways yet another element of these things that indicate or relate in some way to the sense of sight. At the same time, of course, sight was understood as in some ways a weakness or a defect, and it could be even satirized. The famous painting from the 1560s by Bruegel of the blind leading the blind is, of course, part of that opposite tradition. So the loss of sight not as something that indicates learnedness and studiousness, but something that is actually a liability in some ways, something that is something that can be satirized or can be laughed at. And this is, of course, one of his depictions of the parables or proverbs. But in this case, we can see that the loss of sight having this dual meaning in the period. And of course, blindness in the period was also a way in which heresy was described. So someone who is blind is also blind to divine truth, for instance. Heretics, for instance, Protestants are often described as being blind to the truth of Catholicism. So these were ideas that could be read in multiple ways. Now, of course, it's hard to miss, aside from the glasses, the spectacular red sash that our protagonist is wearing. And this is something that I will pose to you as a question, because I have to say, in my research, I've not encountered a satisfactory explanation for the meaning of this sash. However, I'm convinced that it has to be more than just a fashion statement. We see it in other period portraits, perhaps not quite as spectacularly wrapped around his neck, but certainly similar. For instance, in this portrait of the young Philip IV from the Ringling Museum, we see it in the young Philip IV in armor. We see it also in this large painting, perhaps one of Velázquez's most famous, where Spinola, the victorious Spanish general, also wears a large sash thrown over his armor. The only explanation I've found in my research is that Spanish supporters of the 30 Years' War wore such red sashes, but I think that there must be a little more nuance with that. So if anyone has any information, I would absolutely love to hear it, and I myself will continue to look into this question because I continue to be perplexed. I will also note that I found in my research this amazing portrait. It's a little hard to tell. It's hanging in the in Puebla Cathedral in Mexico. where it's the depiction of a bishop whose cloak is so long that it becomes this sash that wraps up his attendant. So there's a fashion accessory you don't see often. The last detail that I'd like to speak about in the painting itself is, of course, the one that has affected how we call this painting, a Knight of the Order of Santiago, or a Knight of Santiago, and that is, of course, the detail that he wears on his chest, on the leather doublet, which is this seashell with a red cross painted on it, or probably in enamel on top of the gold. This is a object of which we might find an example like this, a slightly later example from the early 18th century. And this is, of course, the so-called Cross of Santiago. This marks the individual that we see on the painting as a member of one of the four órdenes militares, the four military orders that were existent in Spain in the early medieval and early modern periods: Santiago, Calatrava, Alcántara, and Montesa. These were orders that were part of the so-called Reconquista, the Reconquest, during which Spanish knights participated in warfare against the various Muslim kingdoms that had populated the Iberian Peninsula since the 8th century. It is specifically the Order of Santiago is, of course, connected to the saint, Santiago, or Saint James, as we know him in English. And the shell emblem is the emblem both of that saint, and it becomes the emblem of pilgrims, especially pilgrims who embark on the so-called Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage route to the great shrine of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, in northwestern Spain. So you'll often see pilgrims today even wearing the shell emblem on their cloak, on their backpack, to mark them as pilgrims and as devotees of St. James, Santiago. And of course, Santiago is closely connected to the Reconquista because, according to legend, in one battle in the 9th century, Santiago, the saint, appeared on horseback in order to assist the Christian armies in their conflict with the Muslim armies at the Battle of Clavijo. And you can see here one of the many artistic representations with this wonderfully expressive steed. And you see here once more both the shell and the cross of St. James that decorate this individual's outfit. Now, these ideas and the military order of Santiago continue throughout the early modern period, that is to say, past even the period of the Reconquista, which officially ends in 1492 with the fall of the city of Granada. These become largely honorific organizations and primarily, if not exclusively, aristocratic organizations. That is to say, to become a member of one of the four military orders is an enormous mark of prestige. People expend enormous amounts of time and energy and money in order to become members of these organizations. And primarily, what they have to prove is not only their aristocratic status, but also what's called blood purity. That is to say that they have among their ancestors no individuals who have performed any sort of manual labor. That's a big no-no. That they have no people who are of Jewish or Muslim faith. So these are the primary categories. And of course, we'll talk in a moment about Velázquez, who is perhaps to us the most famous member of the Order of Santiago and his journey in achieving that status. Now, we looked at this painting last week, the great Auto da Fe of the 1680s, where, of course, one of the things that people were punished for were precisely these same issues that people had to disprove in order to become knights of one of these orders. That is to say that these people were either practicing Judaism or Islam in secret, right? So we see what happens when Spain tries very painfully to transform itself from a multi-confessional or multi-faith society into the most Catholic country in Europe. And this is, of course, part of that process. But I want to point out that when we see here these the prisoners who are being shown crosses, this is what we spoke about last week, we also have accompanying them these individuals with these elaborate embroidered crosses on their cloaks, and these are, of course, members of these aristocratic brotherhoods or knighthoods, of which the Order of Santiago was one. And you can just make out here on this individual's cloak one of these crosses that I've been speaking about. Now, the cross, of course, as we spoke, had multiple meanings, multiple functions. It could be a tool for conversion. It could be a tool for penitential self-reflection. It could be a processional object. In each case, of course, it had this kind of function that served to affect the people who saw it, in some ways to act upon the people who saw it. When an object such as this was processed around a city, it was meant to spread the protective qualities that such an object had. And the processions often served to, in some ways, ritually reinscribe the protections that a city felt that it needed. And so, of course, we discussed why, even in this period, these orders felt the need to continue to be present, because, of course, it was feared, and much of this was anti-Semitic propaganda that was being spread, that crucifixes were being profanated, that people were practicing faiths that were perceived as hostile to Catholicism in secret. So this is all wrapped up in many ways to the topics that we touched on last week. All right, so we've discussed our painting. We've looked at some of the more curious elements on the painting of our knight. And now I'd like to move to discuss Spanish Naples in particular. Scholars agree, as I mentioned, that this portrait likely comes out of Spanish Naples based on questions of style and artistic qualities primarily. So then what was Spanish Naples? What was its role within the larger Spanish monarchy and the universe of the Hispanic world? We, of course, it's easy to forget that when we talk about Spain in this period, we're not just talking about this region of the Iberian Peninsula, but of course we're talking about large parts of the Italian peninsula as well, and of course all of the holdings of the so-called Austrian Habsburgs, the cousins of the Spanish Habsburgs. So this was, and of course the Spanish Netherlands. This was a complex, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic society, of which Spanish Naples formed an important component. Naples had come to the crown of Spain in the mid-15th century with this individual, Alfonso of Aragon, through inheritance. And Naples and Sicily became viceroyalties that were ruled by viceroys. Governor figures who stood in effectively for the King of Spain, who himself rarely, if ever, traveled outside of the Iberian Peninsula. When we think of Philip IV never goes to Naples, but he has multiple representatives who stand in for him in those territories. And it's important to point out that just as Naples and Sicily are viceroyalties, so too Mexico and Peru are viceroyalties that are equally governed by viceroys. These are all territories that have the same legal and political status within the Spanish monarchy. At the top of each one of them is, of course, the King of Spain, but below him are the governors, the viceroys of each of those territories. Naples is, of course, one of the oldest continuously populated cities in the world, and certainly in the Mediterranean basin. It owes its history and its prosperity to being an important port city, a nexus of many trade routes in the Mediterranean, connecting Europe to Africa, east to west. And when it becomes a Spanish city, the Spanish quickly realize that they're not always necessarily welcome there. One of the large urbanistic improvements, quote unquote, that they make in this period is the development of the so-called quartieri spagnoli, the Spanish quarters, effectively an enormous portion of the city that is military barracks for the Spanish garrison that is stationed in that city at all times in order to maintain peace, let's call it, but also at times of unrest to quell that unrest. And we'll see in a moment that unrest did indeed happen. Symbolically also, and many of you might remember this image from my first series of lectures on Ribera in 2017, symbolically Spain inscribed itself throughout the city of Naples. For instance, in this site, the so-called Maschio Angioino, or the new castle of Naples, which is the seat of military and political power in the city. On the inside of this spectacular Renaissance gate in the style of an ancient triumphal arch, we find a fresco that I think many of you might recognize because it depicts not Naples, but Madrid. It is a view of the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, in the Spanish capital, that's been painted in this site of political Spanish power in Naples. The Spaniards are reminding everyone who exits this representational space that, of course, they are part of this larger Spanish universe, and that Naples is in this way symbolically connected to the Spanish capital of Madrid. Now, since the king does not travel, since his governors rule in his stead, it's of course going to be the portrait of the king that carries a lot of the symbolic weight of how rule is instantiated in all of these territories, from Mexico to Lima to Naples. Sure enough, we're going to have portraits of the king made in large numbers and sent out to all of these territories. And we're going to see also that portraits of the viceroys, the people who rule in the king's stead, are going to be very similar, formally, stylistically, to portraits of the king in the period. This is a painting from Mexico City of one of the Mexican viceroys, and you can see how closely, of course, one thing is fashion, but also how closely the artist here is showing that the viceroy is a stand-in for the Spanish monarch, that in his absence, he is the ruler of this territory. We can therefore think of the painting that we have upstairs as very likely a painting of a Spanish viceroy in Naples. And that's actually what scholars largely agree on, that the painting that we have upstairs was a depiction of a Spanish viceroy who was ruling Naples instead of, I should have shown you here, Philip IV, of Philip IV of Spain. Galleries of vice-regal portraits filled these kinds of spaces. I'm showing you here a slightly later view of one of the representational spaces in Palermo, in the Viceroyalty of Sicily, and you can see here the prominence that portraits are given. And of course, you'll notice that these ones are empty, awaiting for portraits of future viceroys to be inserted there. So of course, that suggests that the power of the Spanish not only goes back in time, but also will continue going forward. There's this subtle political propagandistic message there by leaving these spaces, these empty portraits, for the next coming viceroys to arrive there. We saw this painting last week as well when we were talking about processions, and I want to once more remind you that, of course, any sort of event that occurred in a colonial city, be it in Naples, be it in Palermo, or be it in this case in Cusco, Peru, was presided over by a portrait of the king. So although there was a viceroy who was performing all of the day-to-day activities of ruling, the portrait was the symbolically charged object that actually presided over all of these activities. And you can just see it here at the top under a baldachin, that is to say a ceremonial canopy of red fabric with these wonderful plumes of feathers. It's a bit hard to make out, but it's sort of it's feasible that it would have been this type of portrait of the very young still Charles II. We have a portrait of him upstairs that would have presided over these kinds of urban ceremonies. When in central Mexico, the Zapotec people rebelled against Spanish rule in the town of Tehuantepec in 1660. The Spanish sent military forces to quell the uprising, but this was not sufficient to bring the people back into the fold of the Spanish monarchy. The governor of the town of Oaxaca in central Mexico, many of you may have been there, it's a beautiful town, traveled across the 250 miles that separated Oaxaca from Tehuantepec, carrying with him a portrait of Philip IV. He wrote that the king's portrait manifested in his decorous countenance his greatness, his majesty, his benignity, and piety. And all of these qualities were necessary. He had to bring this portrait with him in order so that the portrait could pardon the rebels, that the rebels could be brought back into the fold of the Spanish monarchy through this power that the portrait of the king was believed to have. In Naples, when Masaniello revolted in the mid-17th century, one chronicler writes, "Among the noble things that were seen during the sacking of the city, worthy of mention were the respect that the populace had towards the portraits of His Majesty King Philip IV. During those first onslaughts, the people walked, proclaiming at each step, 'Viva the King of Spain!' They took the portraits to the market and placed them under opulent baldachins with a guard of soldiers. They would momentarily lower their banners, and whenever they passed in front of them, they inclined their heads with the deepest reverence, and at night they lit torches before them and gave other signs of veneration, as if his royal person were present there." I find this a really interesting description because the chronicler, who is on the Spanish king's payroll, really wants to convey how good Naples is. In practice, I suspect that the Neapolitan rebels were perhaps not always so positively inclined to the image of the Spanish king. Pablo Antonio de Tarsia lived in Madrid at the time and wanted very much to convey that Naples did not need to be placed under a series of very painful sanctions as punishment for the revolt. And so he stressed that, of course, people were just acting out, but where it mattered, that is to say, in relationship to these highly symbolic portraits, they knew how to act because they were still faithful subjects of the Spanish king. And I show you here a later example. This is from Colombia, from the 19th century, but showing you how portraits of the king were displayed for these kinds of opportunities, and also to show you once more this idea of what a baldachin looked like. So precisely what Tarsia is saying that was used to shelter the portraits of the king in Naples. That is to say, a piece of gold-fringed, red, symbolically charged fabric that was used to create this kind of temporary shelter for the portrait. Now, in Naples, once more, Masaniello vented his rage against the portraits of the Duke himself, that is to say, the Viceroy of Naples, and the Duke's father, given that he could not do so against the originals. He respected, however, the painted portraits of His Majesty and persecuted the true and living portraits that were his royal ministers. So here, Tarsia is talking about the fact that Masaniello, this Neapolitan rebel, and his troops attacked portraits of the Viceroy, that is to say, the Duke, who was at the time ruling in the king's stead, and also persecuted the Viceroy himself. When he says that he persecuted the living portraits of the king, he's of course referring to the Viceroy, who is in period parlance referred to as the living portrait of the king because he rules in his stead. So Tarsia here is saying that the king is in some ways not at all the target of these people's rage. It's always going to be the Viceroy and the Viceroy's painted representations that the people are rebelling against. And so it's feasible that it would have been precisely this kind of image in Naples that would have been attacked rather than a portrait of the king himself. Now, what I find so interesting about portraits, and specifically royal portraits, is that they continue to symbolize and communicate with people even today. You may have been familiar with the upheavals happening in Spain between the central Spanish government in Castile, in Madrid, and Catalonia, the province, the Catalan-speaking provinces in the east of Spain. And in one town in Spain, people responded very, very viscerally to the fact that in the town hall of this small municipality, there were portraits of Spanish kings still hung. And so this is what the mayor of that town said that they did. We feel extremely far from Spain, and we want to symbolize our rejection of the Bourbon dynasty and of what they did 300 years ago by hanging the portrait of Philip V upside down for a few weeks before we remove all the royal portraits from this municipal building, which represents values that have nothing to do with how the Bourbons have treated the Catalan people. This is from just a few years ago from the town of Cervera. And sure enough, this is what they did. Portraits continue to have this kind of symbolic charge. They continue to create reactions that are strong enough to, in some ways, symbolically punish the image and to symbolically, therefore, punish the figure depicted within. And Cervera was not the only place where this happened. In Játiva, too, which actually is the place where Ribera himself was born, the portrait of Philip V was hung upside down. But in this case, it's a little different because, of course, while they noted that this was also registered their disapproval of current Spanish policies, this was actually replicating how the portrait had been treated in the 18th century. So they were showing here a sort of historic behavior. The one from Cervera, though, is much more sort of a present. So when we return to Naples, the Neapolitan uprising of Masaniello was quelled by troops led by this individual, Juan José de Austria, the illegitimate son of Philip IV. And we see him here in a portrait painted by Ribera himself, and today in Madrid. And he is here, we see him on a rearing horse, once more holding the baston de mando in his hand, which marks him as a military Spanish ruler. And we, of course, can recognize that he is in Naples because we see the Bay of Naples behind him. This painting was then reproduced as an engraving by Ribera himself. And so what's interesting is that it would have been a very kind of similar image to our own painting. Our own painting has to be understood in the political context of a Spanish colonial holding, where there is resistance to Spanish rule and where the rule of the Spanish king is instantiated and spread through not only portraits of the king, but also portraits of his governors, right? So our painting has to be understood in a deeply politicized context. In the same way that last week we talked about how, for instance, a crucifix or a religious painting that is brought into a museum acquires a different kind of function that it may have had during its whole life. Here too, this was a political image that had a real active life in the period when it was made that becomes completely almost invisible to us when we see it on the wall, appreciating it for its primarily aesthetic qualities and sometimes forgetting all of these complex political realities that stand behind it. Now, I quickly want to address one last aspect about Ribera, is that Ribera is a painter who, time and again, when he arrives in Spanish Naples, stresses his identity as a Spaniard. We don't see this here, but this reminds us that Ribera is someone who signs his works by and large. We see his signatures on many of the works that he produces, and oftentimes he will announce in those signatures not only his name, but his identity. You can see that just here, he's signed in this fold of the cloak of St. Bartholomew, Giuseppe de Ribera Español. Giuseppe de Ribera, the Spaniard. And this is part of the reason why he's called always el Españoleto, right? The little Spaniard. And he reminds people of the fact that he is a Spaniard. And this is a very shrewd thing to do, because he's in a city that is one of the most important cities of the Spanish monarchy. His patrons are going to be, by and large, the very wealthy Spaniards who cycle through that city. It's known that in Naples he worked for 11 Spanish viceroys. So he's, of course, capitalizing on the fact that he is from Spain, and he himself can stress this aspect of his identity in order to appeal to potential patrons, the ones who have the money and who have the power for elaborate commissions, by stressing his Spanishness there. If we look at this painting, his wonderful Silenus, we can see how far he goes in stressing and highlighting his identity. And that's, again, in his signature, here being torn apart in a very sort of cheeky way by this very, very ill-behaved serpent. And I'll show you instead of this, I'll show it to you on the example of the engraving, because it's a little easier to make out the text there. So if we look at the detail here, we see that he signs it quite extensively at the bottom. There's a lot of text to work through. So this is what the text says if transcribed. And if we unpack it a little bit, this is how the full text reads. Josef a Ribera, Hispanus, Valentinus, Setaben, Fecit, Partenape, and then the year, 1628. And what he's saying here is Joseph Ribera, Spaniard, Valencian, from the region of Valencia, from Játiva, that's the Latin name of the town where he was born, Játiva, made in Naples in 1628. He's given us all of his various identities to once more stress who he is and where he is at the time. If we think of someone like Velázquez, there's a painter who almost never signs his works. And it's because he's working in a different set of realities. He's at the court of the king. The king is his first and foremost painter. Ribera, on the other hand, is dealing with a constantly shifting landscape. 11 viceroys, that means 11 new relationships to build with powerful patrons. Each time he has to go about establishing himself anew. And so signing his works is going to be a crucial way to, in some ways, bolster and protect his achievements. And this is something to point out with our work. Our work is not signed. So that gives us a question. It's actually led some scholars to see it not as the work of Ribera at all. And this is something that we'll talk about more next week, the topic of attribution. How do we know that something is by someone, basically? In this case, it's largely been in questions of style, that is to say, comparing this to other works by the artist and looking at formal characteristics. How has the artist handled paint? How has the artist worked with a brush in order to see in those qualities a certain hallmark that could stand in for a signature? Others have suggested that perhaps this could be a work of Ribera's younger student, Luca Giordano. We can see here Giordano's wonderful Apollo and Marsyas, and Giordano, of course, was enormously influenced by Ribera. You'll remember from a few years ago the wonderful painting that we had from Capodimonte, this painting, Apollo and Marsyas, and you can see how closely Giordano looked back to Ribera's earlier accomplishments. And Giordano himself, of course, was a painter who enormously benefited from Spanish rule, and actually in the 1690s was called to Madrid, where he created a number of important commissions for the Spanish crown. So in some ways, to me, what's less interesting here is this question of attribution, because I'm interested in these other things around it. But of course, many people very much care who the artist is. And of course, that also tells us something important about the artist. If, for instance, it were to emerge that this is a work by Giordano and not by Ribera, then that would open up a whole new range of possibilities in terms of interpretation that we would have to take into consideration. Now I get to the last part of my lecture today. Who is our knight? Who is the person depicted? And of course, in this case, the Meadows Museum and many scholars agree the artist is Ribera. So who is the person he has depicted? Well, it seems likely that the sitter, this is the term art historians use to describe the person depicted in a portrait, is a Spanish military commander. If indeed this is a Neapolitan work, it seems likely that this could be someone who is in the upper echelons of the Spanish hierarchy there. The fact that he's a member of this very exclusive order of Santiago is a good indication of that. Largely, scholars have thought that if indeed the artist is Ribera, then this is probably a portrait of one of the viceroys. And in some ways, it's surprising that although Ribera served 11 viceroys, there are not more portraits of them by his hand than this one. And even this one is not certain. So this is in some ways a mystery from his artistic production. Scholars have thought that this could be Manuel de Zuniga y Acevedo, or Acevedo y Fonseca. His name is predictably very long, very complex. Largely, and this is, I think, where people run into problems, is that they've used quite simply the appearance of this figure in later engravings as a basis of this decision. So saying basically, he looks sort of like this guy. Now that's not maybe the most scientific method of going about things. Here's another engraving of Acevedo y Zuniga. You can see that he also was a member of the Order of Santiago. He was also a Capitan General, and he also had a very sassy mustache. All of these have led scholars to think of him as a probable candidate for the identity of this sitter. Others, however, have said, no, it's got to be this other viceroy, the Count of Oñate, because he also wore glasses. Again, not the most scientific scholarship here, but of course it is a challenge to that identification. And we sometimes have to step back and say, well, what does it change about our perception of the painting to know who's depicted? Well, it's pretty frequent for the identity of sitters to be lost. And it might be the Count of Oñate, it might be this other viceroy, Acevedo y Zuniga. It's hard to say. We will probably never definitively know unless some sort of document should emerge saying, here is a contract between Ribera or Giordano or who have you and this other figure for this portrait. Until that happens, we'll never have that the smoking gun that will give us that evidence for who created the portrait and who is depicted within it. It's worth pointing out, though, that Acevedo y Zuniga had a relationship with Ribera, and he was an important patron of the arts. When he returned to his hometown of Salamanca in Spain, he commissioned works from a number of the most important Neapolitan artists of the day, including Ribera, for a church that he founded in that city, the Agustinas of Salamanca. I'm pretty sure that's the order that it was. If it's not, please correct me. Including this massive central altarpiece of the Immaculate Conception by Ribera himself. And he is here in perpetual veneration in this wonderful sculpture by the Italian artist Fanelli. Wendy, maybe you can correct me. That's right, Fanelli. Oh, we have a sculpture specialist in the audience, so I was very nervous to say that. But she nodded vigorously, so I think I got it right. Who is in perpetual adoration, and a little hard to see whether his facial features could correspond to our knight upstairs. Now, I promised you a provocation at the end for my conclusion. Here it is. This comes from an article that just came out this week. I'm very happy to share it with you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. No. Okay, all right. I'm very happy to share this article with you and some of the findings, or, well, maybe findings is the wrong word, but some of the speculative or educated guesswork I'm making within it. I start with this portrait of Velázquez, the self-portrait of Velázquez in Las Meninas. If you have ever read Palomino, we have a painting by him upstairs, one of the first art historians of Spanish art and one of the first biographers of Velázquez, will find in that text an interesting anecdote. He says, and we know of this of Velázquez, that Velázquez became a member of the Order of Santiago. After a lifetime of trying, after a lifetime of service at the court, and after a legal trial where he called fellow painters to testify and lie on his behalf, that he had never, and his ancestors had never received payment for any manual activity, such as painting, he was finally granted membership in the Order of Santiago. Now, Palomino gives this nice flourish to this story. He says that the way in which this membership was granted is that the King of Spain himself came up to Velázquez and added to the self-portrait of the painter in Las Meninas the Red Cross of Santiago, painting it himself onto Velázquez's chest, thereby indicating to him that he had been finally elevated into this aristocratic order. This became fodder for many historicist painters. In this case, for instance, a painter named Fred Rowe depicted Philip IV visiting Velázquez in his studio. And sure enough, here we see this story depicted explicitly, where Velázquez sort of leans back, and here in the front, Philip IV, wielding the brush, is about to add the cross to the figure of the painter. I start with this story because it's a convenient way to remind us that although paintings could be finished, people often engaged with them after they went down from their creator's easels and out into the world. We think of a painting on the wall as an untouchable object. Okay, perhaps a conservator in a conservation studio might rework some details, might clean off the varnish, might touch up some places where there's paint loss. But we don't imagine that someone would fundamentally change a painting in order to try to convey something new about the person who's depicted within it. But actually, that's exactly what happened very frequently in the early modern period. Here's a painting that I would ask you, how would you classify, what would you say of a painting such as this one? What kind of painting is this? A portrait, exactly. This seems like a portrait. It has certain qualities that register to us as portraitistic. The artist has clearly depicted a real individual. There are some imperfections here. This is an individual who we could imagine encountering on the street. But I've been a little bit unfair. It's actually a fragment of a larger work. Now, it appears in the inventory of the possessions of a friar who died at the monastery of the Escorial in the 1580s. And one of the objects that are listed in this inventory is listed like this: a portrait of his mother, either by or of this friar, Friar Lorenzo, in oil on canvas-covered board. And then we can see, for instance, other paintings of this type that very clearly are portraits. Then, in the margin, we see another note in another hand. This portrait was changed into the figure of Saint Helena by order of King Philip our Lord. Quite an extraordinary moment. This is precisely one of these smoking gun documents that art historians always hope they'll find. We have actual evidence that someone came along, took a completely finished portrait, and transformed it into something completely different. We even have a record of payment. Rodrigo de Holanda painted 10,000 leaves and 1,000 orange flowers and lemons for the artificial trees for the fountain at La Fresneda. It's good to be king. As well as the trunks of those trees, 17 cranes, 8 windows, 2 iron grates, the cross of a marble Christ, a canvas by Titian, and a figure of St. Helena. And then he, in a different document depicting the same payment, he writes that not painted, but repaired. He repaired a figure of the Queen St. Helena for which he was paid. So we have evidence that not only did the king himself say, let's transform this portrait, which at this moment is completely meaningless to us because we did not know this individual. We are not the friar whose portrait, for whom this was a meaningful object. This was a portrait of his mother. We didn't know this individual. This, in some ways, is an object that is empty to us. How do we repurpose it with meaning? How do we make this into an object that will have utility for all of us? Well, a great way to do that would be to transform it into a sacred image. All of us are Catholics. We can all pray to this image. This image becomes something that has meaning to all of us. And a great way to do that is, of course, through repurposing. And so this is, I think, evidence that this is precisely the process that occurred. And there's even elements in the painting itself that speak to this. For instance, although she's holding now 3 iron nails, this is St. Helena, the saint who was reputed to find the relic of the true cross and is therefore often depicted with the nails of the cross on which Christ died. We see this strange detail here, a string of beads that cuts across her hand, but that has no continuation either below or above. And I suspect that she was probably initially holding a rosary and praying with it. And the artist decided to not obscure this because it would have been hard to match the skin tone, given that the black of the paint underneath would have probably always shown through. So he decided to simply erase them above and below. At me. Oh. that's that. Good thing. That was my timer, and I'm almost done with my lecture, and I promise. And so he left these little elements that tell us that this painting was transformed. Similarly, the crown appears to be quite different in terms of how the artist has painted it. Very different, I think you'll notice, purely in questions of style, based on how it's quite, I don't want to say primitive, but blocky. Very differently handled than the very, very fine, very naturalistic rendering of the paint and the cloth underneath. So I suggest that we call this a painting by an unidentified painter and Rodrigo de Holanda. We should acknowledge both of their hands when we think about it in the future. We'll see multiple paintings such as this, portraits that acquire layers with time. Here someone's added the letters San Felipe Neri to probably a simple portrait, re-identifying it as a painting of a saint. Here we'll see this very awkwardly perched plate with eyeballs, but yes, some of you recognize this is a standard attribute of Saint Lucy. Saint Lucy that has been added to a portrait of a young girl, a girl who's been repainted and repurposed into an image of Saint Lucy. And this could go in both directions, and this is my last example. This is a portrait attributed to Diego Velázquez, I think very convincingly, that came up at auction in Madrid 2 years ago. I would have loved to have this at the Meadows Museum. Let me tell you, we don't know where it is. It went into a private collection, but what a beautiful painting. When it was X-rayed, and then when it was recently cleaned, it was revealed that it wasn't simply a portrait, but actually that it was originally a painting of the young Virgin Mary. It's hard to know what happened here. We can oftentimes not easily reconstruct the life history of objects. It may have been that a family commissioned this painting as a portrait of a young girl purposefully depicted as the Virgin Mary. These kinds of images were actually quite frequent in the period. And perhaps at a later moment, maybe because they were afraid of punishment by the Inquisition, which did not like these kinds of images, let me tell you, they obscured it, removing the halo and leaving it as a simple portrait. So these kinds of objects moved in both directions. You could have portraits of people explicitly depicted as saints. You could have portraits of actual saints that were based on their real likenesses in life. And like the examples we've been talking about, you could have repainted portraits, portraits that were refilled with meaning by transforming them into sacred images. Now, we don't know who our sitter here is. And we don't know when that information was lost. And I hope to have convinced you that if the life journey of this object had been just a little bit different, then rather than ending up at the Meadows Museum, it could have been transformed into something like this. Thank you very much.